Morning, hello. I'm just going to carry on with part 5 now of the analysis of the Dewi Evans, Dr. Dewi Evans interview on Talk TV. But before that, I just wanted to read a little excerpt from the Law, Health and Technology newsletter, Law, Health and Tech Substack, that Dr. Scott McLachlan writes. And this is part 6. It's the title of the article is part 6, LL part 6, The Incredible Dr. Dewi Evans. And there was a part here that really struck me in this. It's about the principle of before you start accusing somebody of a crime and bringing charges against them, you've got to establish whether there's a crime there at all. And in this case, I don't think there are any crimes there at all. I don't believe there's any crimes happened at all. I mean, there's negligence from the hospital in all sorts of ways. That's why there were negligent claims in the offing at the same time, just before and around the same time before the police were brought in for the Countess of Chester Hospital. Anyway, I'm going to read this little bit here. It's part of that article that Dr. McLachlan has written. So it begins, this is a case which both prosecution and defence characterise as consisting solely of circumstantial evidence. When considering the strength of circumstantial evidence, the historic but often cited text, I'm going to put this in the description bar, and this is the text from an old piece of writing on law. Often cited text, Starkie on Evidence, 3rd edition, 1842, so it goes back a long way. It tells us, quote, "It is essential that the circumstances should, to a moral certainty, actually exclude every hypothesis, but the one proposed to be proved. Hence results the rule in criminal cases that the coincidence of circumstances tending to indicate guilt, however strong and numerous they may be, avails nothing unless the corpus delicti, that's like the body of the crime, the fact that the crime has actually been committed, be first established." You've got to establish that there's been a crime committed before you prosecute it, charge it even, before it even gets to the CPS, should never have got there. That piece of writing there from the 1842 document, Starkie on Evidence, and I'm still quoting from Dr. McLachlan's Substack article. It goes on to say that above, quote, "This is explained by Mr. Ian Barker QC as meaning that, irrespective of the strength and volume of circumstantial evidence presented, unless every other possible explanation for the outcome has been identified and excluded by inquiry of, in italics, the most scrupulous attention, it remains nothing more than mere coincidence." So that's so relevant, obviously, and that's why Dr. McLachlan's put that there. All the other possibilities for the events, the sad deaths and the crashes of the babies, they weren't explored. They weren't explored and they weren't discounted by Evans at all. To what degree he was completely corrupt? Well, we can only infer that. But he's corrupt in the sense that he's not acting as an expert at all in any way whatsoever. He's a sham and a fraud, and he's gone for one line here, and that's to support what this group of consultants have been saying, that it's Lucy's fault, and he's going to ratify that with his findings. But his findings don't include all the other, medical and scientific possibilities for why these crashes and these deaths occurred. He doesn't go there. He doesn't try to falsify his hypotheses at all. So they're worthless, as the judge said to him in a previous trial. His evidence is worthless, but that somehow it's got through again and destroyed another life. So back to the quotes from the Talk TV interview Dr. Dewi Evans gave towards the end of August. Quote, "Other babies suffered direct trauma. They were found with blood around their mouths or blood at the back of their throat. So all of these babies collapse." You feel stress from him before he says the word collapse in the interview. He stresses out. Collapse could not be explained at all. He makes it very, very, very incisive there. At all, other than someone had caused harm to them. Well, this overemphasis of at all, it just means that he's gone for that. He hasn't excluded the other possibilities. And they challenged him a bit in court, but there were no experts to challenge him, and that's the problem. That's why his fraudulent, bogus evidence was allowed to carry sway and affected the jury's decision, obviously, because there was nobody there to challenge him, that the jury could see, oh, here's another doctor, here's another science saying, look, Dr. Evans hasn't considered this or that. But in the short time, in the less than, about a month since the verdict and slightly prior to it, people like Dr. McLachlan have come up with all these other possibilities. And other people have, with the science on trial people, or all these other possibilities are out there about why these things occurred. But Evans is just fixated on his determination to make sure that Lucy Letby is convicted. That's what it is. He's a corrupt individual, he's a fraud, and a very dangerous man. You need to look into and read all the articles that Dr. McLachlan has written on his law, health and tech Substack, to look for, and some of the articles on the Rex v Lucy Letby Facebook page, to look for alternative reasons why there was blood at the back of the throat of these babies, and it was to do with various procedures that they'd had done and potentially other medical conditions they have. So I won't go through them all here. It's best that you go to the source for those, which are this Law, Health and Tech Substack is the prime one that I would advise for anyone who hasn't looked at it already. There's explanations here that Evans just bypasses because he's not interested. He's not interested in looking for anything that's exculpatory of his determined view to make sure Lucy Letby is convicted. And it's my supposition, my theory is that he knows full well who's in the frame while he's going through these notes and making these reports. That's what I believe. A lot of the research and a lot of the other arguments that's been done with regard to the two insulin cases, that many people in the general public assume that those babies died, but no, they didn't die. They were two of the attempted murders charges. And so this goes on now. The quote goes on here in relation to the two babies, where they say that they were given large amounts of insulin. So this is a quote from Dewi Evans. And then later in 2018, so there's quite a big gap here, I found two more cases. Well, he didn't find them. Someone else found them. Breary. These were second of twins. Two separate lots of twins who had low, then he stumbles, blood glucose values. Now, low blood glucose or low blood sugar is common in small babies. This is Evans speaking. But a very astute medical officer at Chester, I'm assuming that is Breary that looked at these notes, that's what we hear anyway, Dr. Breary, had measured these babies' insulin level, and the insulin level was very, very high. I think it's Breary that looked at the notes of whoever the medical officer is, whoever that was. And the insulin level was very, very high, which could not be explained on the basis of their producing their own insulin. So in addition to the other items of trauma, we now had 2 babies who had, stumble, insulin injected. I've got a break off here. This is what Dewi Evans said, insulin injected. So he's saying this after the trial, that they had insulin injected. This is how wacky this guy is. But throughout the whole trial, the whole court case, and all the evidence given back and forth, it was stated that the insulin had been put into these TPN bags, these nutrition bags. So, but Dewi Evans is saying here that insulin had been injected into their system. So it's a complete contradiction to what happened during the actual court case that he was part of. And now he's saying injected. How do you explain that? How does anyone explain that? And then he carries on. So that was an additional concern, not something that anyone had suspected initially. The guy's a basket case. He's a basket case. And he goes on to say, in fact, I owe it to Chester police for being obsessive and methodical in their investigation, or they were obsessive. Because see, that was an interesting slip. He starts to say we. He says, I only saw the insulin poisoning cases, and then there's a gap where he's trying to think what to say, because they were the second of twins who'd have been harmed in other ways. Doesn't say what those ways are. Oh, and this was a complete shock to me and a complete surprise, but it was quite important actually, because at last one could find some kind of smoking gun. In other words, one could show that someone was causing harm to babies. Good Lord. So he's admitting there that without these 2 cases, there's no quote-unquote smoking gun. So would any of the other cases of the air embolus, would they have got past the CPS, let alone to a trial? No. No, this is just a confection to bring everything together, just to push all these unfortunate deaths and crashes onto one innocent person. Isn't it convenient that they found these nearly a year later in 2018, that they found these 2 other cases related to the insulin? And look, to keep remembering this, he's basing all his views on looking at medical notes, which may be incomplete. I'm not going to go in any depth, because I'm not a medical person, about the arguments against his theories that insulin is the only way that these results could have been shown on those medical notes. Again, the best thing to do is to go to the Law, Health and Tech Substack about that. And there's specific articles there about insulin and all the other potentialities there, including actually that both the babies concerned were actually on certain amounts of insulin prior to their health crash, because these 2 babies, thankfully they didn't die. They just had a very sudden crash and deterioration in health. So that's the place to look. But I might have a go at doing a video on that, but I'd have to be a much more on top of it in order to speak off the top of my head what the arguments were. I'd have to research that more. But I've read them and they sound convincing to me, but I'm not a medical person. Suffice it to say, there are arguments against there are many arguments now against every part of Evans's theories as to how, as the evidence he gave in court, as to how the babies died or crashed. And that's what was missing from the defence, obviously. But will that happen at the appeal? It's got to. That's what they've got to do. But just want to repeat again, isn't it interesting? This is an interview that happened after the verdict. And he's talking about the insulin being injected. But throughout the whole trial, it's all about who put insulin into these TPN bags. The bags with the sort of the liquid sort of feed for the babies. Who put it into those? And he's talking here in this interview after the verdict that they've been injected. Complete contradiction to the evidence and to the accusation that somebody had put it into these bags. Very weird man. One of the sort of theories to attack his evidence is that through certain health conditions, there could be raised level of naturally produced insulin in the bodies of these babies. That in other words, it wasn't synthetic insulin given, and they didn't do a test to establish that it was synthetic insulin either. They didn't do that test. That was missing. So there's no conclusive proof at all, and there are tests that you could even do which will actually tell you which brand of synthetic insulin it was, but they didn't do them. But anyway, there are these health conditions, and that brings me on to the side note. There was a case of a Scottish nurse called Colin Norris. He's been in prison for 15 years, and he was convicted of murdering 4 people, elderly people, and attempted murder of 1 person with insulin. But his case, after all that time in prison, has just been referred to the Court of Appeal. And it's thought now that his conviction is unsafe because due to subsequent studies, it's found that that the body can produce certain higher levels of insulin than they had hitherto thought, or at least that were presented in that trial, his trial, which got him convicted for injecting insulin into people. But now the argument's going to be no, that's what the argument of the appeal is, no, that insulin could have been naturally produced in the poor individuals' bodies who died, and it wasn't Colin Norris who injected them with them. So that's just about to happen. I don't know exactly when that's going to happen, but it's been agreed that it's gone to the Court of Appeal. So that's Colin Norris, Colin and Norris. You can look up the case on Wikipedia. So he's been in prison for 15 years. You've also got the case of Benjamin Geen related to insulin poisoning. And the barrister Mark MacDonald, I believe, is acting for him there. Similar case to the Colin Norris case. So there may be an appeal there as well. You've got all these instances now, or several instances, where nurses have been accused of these things and it's not been conclusive after all, but they've been in prison we just hope it's not going to take anything like that and hope that Lucy will be out as soon as possible. The trouble is that the legal system in this country, judiciary, that just drags its feet. And there's a phrase, isn't there, and it says, justice delayed is justice denied. So if they delay the appeal, then they're denying the justice to Lucy, so that she can be freed on appeal, and I think she will be. She should be. It's just an absolute stitch up, fit up by those doctors, Evans and the police and the CPS, obviously, and the judicial system playing its role. So yeah, on Wikipedia or elsewhere, you can have a look at the cases of Colin Norris and Benjamin Geen. Geen spelled Geen. I'll put a link. I'll put a link in the. If I've got enough characters I can fit in, because I want to put that quote in, that legal quote that I said at the beginning. So yeah, just to reiterate, without those 2 alleged insulin poisonings, whether it's injection or through the TPN bag, the allegation of that, would any of the others have stood up? Because he says here, he goes on to say, the quote is, whereas, in comparison to his hypothesis for the insulin, he says, whereas with injection of air, unless someone sees you doing it, then you can't prove that anything, he stutters, you can't prove that anything. And then he says, it would have been difficult to prove that these babies were placed in harm's way. Difficult to prove it. He's saying there's an acknowledgement that without these other allegations of the insulin cases, 2 babies who didn't die. All these other alleged murders couldn't have even been brought. That's what I believe. That's what I think. It wouldn't have been possible. They would have failed. Or they would have failed in court. Look how thin all this evidence is. And it's not evidence, it's his determined, it's Evans's and the police's and the doctor's determination to avoid looking at any other possibilities for this, which is one of the most unjust things I've ever come across in my life. It will all come out. It will all come out how bad, what a travesty of justice this has been, what a monstrous attack on an innocent life this has been. I might leave it there now. It's getting to about 20 minutes. Sorry if I've rambled a bit. I hope that's sort of clear. The quote from the legal quote from Dr. McLachlan's Substack is really important as a matter of principle, to show that they didn't have the intention to exclude all the possibilities, so that they determined it was a crime without really proving it there was a crime there, and they just ran with that as an everyday fix. But it was for a reason, or a set of reasons related to those doctors and to that hospital. It's absolutely ghastly. I hope we hear this week that, or as soon as possible, that the judge has accepted the application for leave to appeal for Lucy Letby and her legal team. Anyway, thanks for watching if you have. I hope it hasn't been too all over the shop. But yeah, and have a look at those other cases, because I think they could be instrumental. Colin Norris and Benjamin Geen. If at appeal, those 2 people, well, certainly appeal is going to happen for Colin Norris. I'm not sure exactly the status for Benjamin Geen at the moment. If they are released and deemed not guilty, innocent on appeal, that could have very strong ramifications for Lucy's case in specifically in relation to the 2 babies that they say were deliberately poisoned with insulin. Anyway, take care. Bye-bye.